All right, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Weaver. I'm president of Brewmation, and I'm here with Mike and Don. If you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Hey, everyone.
All right. So Mike O'Neill is also with Brewmation, and Don Marcil is with Stout Tanks and Kettles. And the three of us are going to go through turnkey breweries. Appreciate you coming out and sharing your either morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. I'm in on the East Coast, so it's just turned afternoon. I know Don is on the West Coast, so it's a little bit earlier for him. But glad to see some locations of where people are coming from. I see a Dallas show up, Iowa, another New York. That's great. We really appreciate you guys coming out here and chatting with us. And we have San Antonio as well, Chris. We wish we were down there with you this week. But yeah, so we're going to go through, I'm going to talk a little bit in the beginning here, just a general overview of turnkey breweries. And then I'm going to pass it on to Michael to talk about soft piping. And then Michael's going to pass it on to Don to talk about hard piping breweries. Oh, wow, we got a Norway. Welcome from Norway. And then we're going to get into a Q&A at the end. But as we go through, you can ask questions on the right-hand side. We may just jump in and answer them as we go, or we may just save them to the end. And we also have Romania. Excellent. This is amazing. Glad to see it. All right, I'm going to sign off on my video and just to make the screen a little bit bigger. Michael and Don, if you could do the same thing, we'll get started. All right, so here's the general topics that we're talking about. Again, turnkey brew houses. What does turnkey mean? Why go turnkey? And what's included and what isn't? Very subjective question there. Soft piping. What does soft piping look like? When and why to use soft piping? What will I need? And a little bit of a question. I've got my parts. Now what do I do? Then Don will get into hard piping. When and why to use hard piping? What does hard piping look like and how to do it right? All right, so let's jump right into the turnkey brew houses. So really, what does turnkey mean? And it's an interesting question because it could be really perceived as a whole host of things. And sometimes you have to really dig in so that you set your expectations when you're looking at a turnkey package. Generally in the brewing industry, what I found is turnkey means purchasing all of the equipment from one place and vendor as an integrated system. That's the bulk of it, and that's typically what we talk about, especially for saying turnkey brew house. And a turnkey would or could include typically tanks, of course, controls, heating systems, cooling systems, the brew house pumps throughout, plumbing. Again, we'll get into soft piping and hard piping, the milling equipment, and right down to keg washing and filling equipment. Of course, it can go beyond that. We'll touch on that a little bit. So the real question is, why would I want to go to turnkey, and as opposed to buying parts and pieces all yourself? Well, one of the things that is part of a turnkey is obviously everything is going to be matched, so it's going to reduce inefficiencies. And what do I mean by that? There's a couple examples we'll go through. So if you had a malt mill, as an example, that you might have purchased in one spot, and then of course you have the size of your brewery that you're purchasing, your mash tun, that's a different capacity. Having one that's too small, obviously you're going to take a lot of time filling your mash tun, especially folks going from home brewing into professional brewing. They may have a smaller one, but that gets old pretty quick when it takes quite a bit of time to fill up your mash tun when you're trying to grain in. Also, graining in, especially if you're doing it through a blender, if you don't have the rates matched, you'll end up going through all your brew water before you end up going through your grains. And that's not a desirable situation. So the size of that would typically be matched. And it definitely would be matched on the turnkey system. But there's also the type of mill. Now on the standard brewing, you're going to be using a roller mill, and that roller mill is used at the majority of the time. But there's also a hammer mill. So there's different styles out there. What we generally see is the hammer mill is used in conjunction with a filter press. Filter press kind of breaks a lot of the rules in brewing, so you end up pretty much pulverizing the malt. I've seen, however, hammer mills used in regular brewing. Depends on what kind of other than grains, what else you might be putting it through putting through your system. So sometimes the hammer mill does have a place. So matching them not only for size, but for what the application is very key. One of the biggest things here is matching your heating system to the size of your brewery. When you're looking at an electric system, you want to make sure that you have the heating elements that are not only sized by the kilowatt for your brew house, but also for the low watt density. So it's a lot of times the number of elements and also the length of the elements. You can run into that where you have elements that might be too long for a smaller brewery. Like if you have a 1 or 2 barrel system, sometimes you have to be careful of the heating element, make sure that it'll actually fit in your tanks. But the other side of that is to have enough elements that you have plenty of surface area for your heating so you don't end up with scorching and things along those lines. And a third aspect of the electric is to have enough power to the building that you can actually handle all of those heating elements, and especially if you're doing double batching. So you might want to be able to run your hot liquor tank and your kettle at the same time, as an example. So on a turnkey system, we really match up to all of that. The supplier would talk to you about how much power you have in the building and all to make sure that you have ample power for an electric system. And the same goes for the boiler size. When we look at boiler systems for customers, and not only are we looking at the size of the brewery, but how the brewery is going to be utilized. Do you want to run, again, the hot liquor tank, mash tun, kettle at the same time? A lot of times we'll size a boiler for future expansion. So you might be starting out with a small system. Maybe you're starting out with a 2 barrel or a 5 barrel system, and you want to eventually get up to a 10 barrel system. Then it makes sense to put a bigger boiler in ahead of time so that you have room for that expansion. Also matching the boiler to other aspects of the brewing. If you're using a keg washer as an example that uses steam or some other things, maybe you're going to add a distillery, go down the road. So all of these things get talked about and implemented into a turnkey system when it comes to the heating. And the same is true for direct fire. It's not shown here, but the size of the burners are very key to be matched up to the vessel. Pumps are a really big topic on a turnkey system. Because not only are there different sizes of pumps, but there's different capacities and different designs of the pump. So you have positive displacement pumps, you have centrifugal pumps, all sorts of different types. There's load pumps, there's impeller pumps, even air-operated diaphragm pumps. And they all have a purpose. So it's not just a matter of looking at a flow rate. Say, oh, well, if I have 22 gallons per minute, that's going to cover me. What has to be considered is the application for the different pumps. As an example, your water pumps can be a pump. So let's just talk about centrifugal for a minute. It could be a pump with an external seal. And with that external seal, you're going to be fine running water, CIP. And you can use them for hot wort, but they tend to leak and get buildup on the seals because they get pushed away because they're external, they're under some pressure. So in those cases, they become a little bit more maintenance intensive, but they do work. But when we're looking at the turnkey system, then what we'll do is take a look and say, okay, well, you're going to be running hot wort, especially for whirlpool transfer through a plate chiller. And in those cases, with a centrifugal pump, we'll use an internal seal. So just a quick overview of pumps. There's a lot of different types. We even incorporate peristaltic pumps, which are a positive displacement dosing pump for sparging, where you'll have an exact amount of water going into the mash tun as you do coming out of the mash tun. So that's a good example of a different style pump that could be used. Again, all kind of looking at the whole scope of the project, making it a turnkey system. Chilling, especially the plate chiller, you don't want to undersize that. If you undersize it, you're going to end up having inefficient chilling. So either you're not going to hit your pitching temperature and you have to do the rest of the cooling in the fermenter, or you'll have to run way too slow in order to get it chilled. Most of the time, you're looking at a 30-minute to 45-minute chill down time. So if it runs a lot longer than that, you're going to have more contact time with your hops. All sorts of different characteristics are going to change, and you'll end up losing consistencies throughout your brew process. So doing a plate chiller and having it sized properly actually goes both ways as well. You don't want to undersize it, but also you don't want to oversize it. If you end up oversizing it, you can end up losing inefficiencies. You may have pumps that are not able to pump through the plate chiller because they do have a high pressure, back pressure rating. and the head pressure, I should say, will end up increasing to the point where it's not going to properly push through the plate chiller. So it goes back to the pumps, matching the pumps to the plate chiller. So there's a little bit more to it than simply having one big enough. Sometimes bigger is not better in that case. So plate chiller is definitely something to look into, and also one that is expandable. So if you do want to, like the example before, you have a 5, you want to go to a 10 eventually, you can get a plate chiller that's expandable to a 10, but you would not necessarily put those plates in until afterwards. So this is all part of the turnkey matching. Another great topic on turnkey is the glycol chiller. When you look at the size of the glycol chiller, there's a lot of things to look at. So just having a big chiller and you found one and plopping it in place and running your lines, you might hit it, but you have to really take into consider a lot of things, and those things are considered in a turnkey system. The questions there are how many tanks, what size tanks do you have, and then what do you plan on in the future? So we're really looking at the whole scope of the chilling. So when you look at chilling, you might be able to figure it out and say, okay, well, I'm going to have X amount of tanks, and this is the cooling capacity, so that's my chiller. I need one that's going to handle X amount of BTUs. There's other considerations, however, and that's what we do with the turnkey is we consider what the volume is needed from the chiller. So a lot of times you may have plenty of BTUs, but you just won't have enough volume because that particular chiller is not big enough to handle X amount of tanks at the same time. So like when we work with some of the chillers that you see pictured there, we kind of have a rule of thumb, 8 or 9 tanks. Jackets are a limit to one particular type or style. But when we end up knowing that there's going to be more, but we don't have a big BTU load, then we're going to have to step up to a different series, which is going to give us a lot more flow going through those jackets. So again, trying to get away from mismatched items, the chiller is a big one because it's an expensive item for one, but also the installation is a little bit complex. It might be up on a roof, pouring a pad for it. So you don't want to get that wrong. And also you want to do it once if you're going to be doing expansion. So that's something that's always considered in a turnkey package. So I think I'm kind of going through on why turnkey, get the picture as far as really matching everything in a cohesive system, preventing bottlenecks, and also having one fully integrated system. So, we kind of encompassed in this picture here, this graphic showing all of the different components. And then of course with a control panel that's sitting there, and in an integrated turnkey system, that control panel is handling all of these pieces of the operation to make them operate cohesively. So even when you look at electric elements, of course, you need a control panel that's going to match the electric elements because it has to handle that wattage and a number of heating elements. It's the number of pumps. It's all the different ancillary equipment as well that is going to manage. And even if you get that panel, there's also expansion. We're talking about that with chillers and all the other parts. That expansion on a control panel is key. So if something that you might end up wanting to put in a filter press one day, then having a system that can expand and add modules for that would be key. Same thing for looking at your jacketed tank load. If you're going to go beyond, say in our case, we do 8-point modules. So once you go beyond 8 and you say, okay, I'm going to have 9, 12, 18, however many tanks you're going to have, then you could add modules. So again, the turnkey system takes into account a lot of your expansion potential. So what else is to be considered on turnkey? Well, there are companies for sure that will also offer some services beyond just the brew house. You could have part of your turnkey. It could be a rigging company that comes in. We've done that on a few occasions where the rigging company would come in, set the equipment, perhaps even build out some platforms. Just kind of a couple pictures that I'm showing that a lot of times maybe you're not going to go and add this part to the turnkey. You might have somebody who has a tow truck that's going to bring in your tanks. So that's perfectly acceptable on a small system. But if you have much larger tanks, then rigging will be part of it. But a lot of times local rigging companies will be incorporated for that. Kind of the same thing with the plumbing, electrical, and HVAC. Turnkey could include all that, where the company that's supplying the equipment, the package, could come in and handle those items. But typically those are handled locally because of the inspections and local approvals that are needed. Typically the plumbers, the electricians, HVAC, they know everybody, so it makes for a smoother operation. So just some kind of, it could be included, doesn't have to be included, but sometimes for a completely turnkey system that may be desired. And kind of get into what else could be part of a turnkey beyond what we've talked about already. And it could be that taken to a much higher level where you start getting into equipment layout renderings and architectural drawings. I know in our case, we do a lot of layouts. Some of these are here, ones that we've done for customers just to kind of show what their equipment would look like in the space using SolidWorks. And that's pretty typical to do just to really understand how many tanks can fit into a space. And we do that up front, typically even before it becomes a sale, just to kind of figure out exactly what the turnkey package is going to be. But it's a very nice service to be had with a turnkey company is to have a lot of this that could be turned over to a local architect. Architectural drawings could be done by the turnkey company, but typically stamped drawings are required for approvals. So again, the recommendation is to do that locally. But a lot of these layout drawings that are done as part of the turnkey package could be handed over to the architect to be implemented into the planning so that you have the stamped drawings and you can get your approvals pretty quickly. Some additional considerations, there's quite a bit to think about, but budget is obviously a very big one. What makes sense to your business plan? If a lot of these turnkey type of things, especially when you look at expansion, could be pretty spendy, but if it's not part of your business plan, then it wouldn't make sense. So you have to really take a look at that. And it doesn't mean that a turnkey package has to be expensive. It could be one that's very economical, that's put together, but that level of turnkey a lot of times gets driven by the business plan and what's affordable. And it also really has a lot to do with what the ability is. We work with plenty of customers who have a lot of talents. It could be that they're an electrician in their old life and now are going into brewing, so they might handle all the electrical themselves. We've worked with architects that are going to become brewers. We've done doctors too, but that doesn't really help too much when you have to do electric and plumbing. But the ability, obviously, if there's relatives or friends that are part of the brewery, partners that have skills, then that part of it could be left out, and you could save yourself some money and put your own personal touch on things. Another really big one is utility. We talked about that a little bit before. Do you have enough power in the building? Deciding on what type of system you're going to put in. Do you have gas or propane on site if you're going to be doing a boiler or direct or indirect fire system? Sometimes having a proper gas line coming into the building is not available, so you might have to go to electric, and then vice versa. If you don't have enough power, you're going to end up going for a steam or a direct fire indirect system. So those are things that the turnkey provider will work through to make sure that you dot those I's, cross the T's before the major decisions are made. And also we talked about the layout, where can the brew house fit? And how do you get that brew house in place? And that's a really big consideration. We've put breweries in such tiny areas, down in basements, up on upper floors, et cetera. So sometimes soft pipe system makes sense. Sometimes a hard pipe system makes sense. And that's the perfect segue for me to get into handing this over to Mike O'Neill, who will talk about soft piping. Mike, it's all yours.
Thanks, Evan. Good segue too. All right, so I'm going to be jumping into it now. I'm going to take away my camera and get into the slides. Here we go. So soft piping. This is, you see here often what the perception is when you hear soft piping. You see a little bit of a disorganization, ununiformity between the different hoses and connections, sort of a hodgepodge, if you will, of different materials. And just everything very, very much crisscross, not really aesthetically pleasing ultimately. But that's not necessarily, what soft piping has to look like with your system. The potential of soft piping is, just like with hard piping, you're gonna have very clean lines. You have a very nice, presentable looking system, fairly direct hose runs, and just simple A to B connections. As you see here, this is something that, I don't think this would turn me off to sitting right next to this in a brewery. This would be, very, very sort of inviting, sort of almost a showpiece, if you will. Now, What is soft piping? In short, it's simply put just a system that is using more or less sort of flexible hosing to make some connections. Now, this setup, see here in the very top, this has a lot of hard piping included in it. I know it's depending on the size of the screen you're looking at, you may or may not be able to see, but in between each one of these tanks, everything is hard pipe spools leading to the pumps, exiting from the pumps for drain lines. So there's really only a handful of connections that take the water and the wort from point A to point B. You look at the picture on the bottom there. That sort of showcases small diversions. You can just easily. You don't have to do a lot of hose swapping. That's another thing that a lot of people think about when they think soft piping. And you don't have to swap, from connection A to connection B. What you can do is easily set up T's and valves to change your direction. So any pump can be either fed by multiple sources and can end up transferring your product into to multiple tanks and into multiple directions with a setup sort of like this. Now, soft pipe setup, it's really going to be convenient, especially if you have individual tanks. Maybe tanks that weren't designed with the other tank in mind. Back to that top picture there, you see we've got a slightly larger hot liquor tank there. That's a 3-barrel hot liquor tank paired up with a 2-barrel mash tun and kettle. More hot water is always needed, but that tank is a little bit larger, so some of its ports, don't quite match up with the 2-barrel ports. So this is where the soft pipe setup helps makes the system work cohesively without having to get overly custom with a hard pipe setup. So what you see a lot of times with the soft pipe setups is it's similar to what most breweries are doing on their cellar side of things. You don't necessarily have set connections. You're bringing in hoses to make these connections, but again, you can grow to where your connections are set, and you're using just valves and more or less you can make a system sort of hard piped and really well planned with only a couple of small connections to make something work together. Now that brings me to why use soft piping. There's some you know pretty much three big reasons why you'd want to go the route of soft piping. The first, that's going to be time. Hard piping is a great option, but sometimes can be very stringent as far as what space is required for it, how much planning needs to go into making sure that it's gonna accommodate your space as needed. So if you're looking for a very quick turnaround, you've signed your lease, you've got everything lined up, you're looking to get brewing as soon as possible. That's going to make it perhaps a little bit difficult to get the exact system for you on a hard pipe setup. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that you have your ideal system, everything works together. But we can get this together a little bit faster. Soft piping allows you to plumb everything together, a little bit more on the fly or in shorter notice. There is room for error. You can very quickly, if something comes up in the brew house design that forces a last minute change, you can roll with the punches with the soft pipe setup. Next would be what more or less what I just stated would be the flexibility of a soft pipe setup. So you're not going to have to wrestle with really specific plumbing runs. This is something where if you need to alter the location of the kettle in relation to your platform, to your mash tun, then you can simply rearrange these soft pipe runs. Now, the last one space. Uh, I've worked with a number of projects where the space maybe wasn't for the brew house. That is not the most ideal. Sometimes your ideal location on the main street in the historic building that's been reclaimed doesn't always have the ideal location for your brew house operation. This could be either smaller ceilings. Maybe it's an old building, so the rooms weren't as wide and open, and perhaps this is even a location that is considered historic and will limit your ability to greatly renovate the space. So with that in mind, there are a lot of projects where you simply just don't have the square footage, for certain setups. So you have to do with what you will, what you can, and that's where having the flexible hose runs allows you to really specifically plan out how you're gonna make it work in your space, without having to really sacrifice too much. Another benefit to the flexibility is going to be rearranging. This is something that can come into play if, let's say, you start to use the system, but you find that ultimately you've maybe attended some seminars, and ultimately you can come up with a better layout. This could be, no more than a weekend's worth of work of rearranging your setup, whether it's bringing in additional pumps, additional vessels, or you're just wanting to simplify the setup. This makes it very easy. You can just rearrange, uh, reallocate all of the hose lines, and before you know it, you've refined your process. 75% of all breweries change their layouts after receiving their equipment. That's not a real statistic. That's just off the cuff. But we're definitely we're experiencing that this happens quite a bit, and it's going to happen uh, through the natural progression of a brewery's lifetime, one way or the other, most likely. Whether again, back to what I was saying before, if you choose to redesign your layout because you've learned as a brewer, as an owner, and you've grown, you find better ways to do things. That's one scenario. But a lot of times you're going to end up changing your brewery regardless as you grow. Whether it's to incorporate additional vessels, expand on your cellar, bring in a canning line. Um, you're going to grow, and it's hard to say exactly how. If you're looking 5 years into the future, it's you can't necessarily have planned that you would have been getting into packaging if you had maybe just a brew pub tap room style business plan. So this is definitely another reason where flexibility comes into play. Separately, if you're really making it, and you're looking to get a whole new big brew house, you can take your original brew house, especially if it was a smaller one, and you can find a different location in your facility, and maybe reassign that as your pilot system. Or another expansion possibility is to open separate locations, create a whole new radius for foot traffic. And I know a lot of states are going to require that you have a brew house there. So in this scenario, you can take the brew house whose home was in your original brewery, and simply transport it and reset it up in a new building without having to worry too much about what that space is and whether or not it'll accommodate that original brew house. What are the parts and pieces that you'd be using? Well, it's not too different than what you'd be using on the cellar side of things. You're going to be using a fair amount of brewer's hose. This is insulated hose, so you can be working with the hot temperatures and not have to be concerned about the hose being too hot to touch. This is going to be kind of hose that's put together for food and high temperature processes. And then some Sanapreme tubing, some more lightweight, flexible tubing. This is going to be for those portions of the brew house where you're not switching any hoses. It's a little bit more set, um, but definitely having this more flexible hosing helps you set it up to where the lines aren't. They can make bends and turns and things like that, making it a lot easier to set up a clean brew house. The rest of your parts, all of those connection points. You want to keep it very sanitary, very tri-clamp based. Avoid threading as much as possible, and there's parts are out there, so it really shouldn't be an issue. So when it does come time to break down these hoses for maybe a deep clean, it's very simple to just untri clamp and break down everything and clean everything. So really, there's no limit to how to set up or what type of system you can use this sort of piping setup for. 2-vessel, 3-vessel, 4-vessel. As Kevin mentioned earlier, mash press could be incorporated. Uh, Layout, really, you can have the tanks in a sort of a 1, 2, 3 next to each other formation, or one tank could be behind the other two if it's a cramped space. The number of pumps that you have, you can accommodate that, of course. Definitely something that helps out the soft pipe setup. At least 2 pumps, maybe a third or fourth pump can also help prevent the need to have excessive valve turns or to have to tri clamp and reposition hoses while you're brewing. Good way to really make sure that you avoid that sort of visual that we saw on the first slide was really to measure. You know how your system's going to be plumbed up. You can start off by drawing this out, but you lay out your pumps, your tanks, and make some measurements. A lot of times, I recommend you can mock it up at first before you start cutting hoses, and then realize, well, this isn't too long, this isn't long enough, or this is too long. Mock it up with string so that you can really get all of those lines, all those hose runs, as taut as possible. What you want to really try and do is you want to avoid uh, excess hose. You don't want to have these sagging hoses where from A to B, liquid is just going to sit in this valley of a hose. That's going to eventually it's going to cause some bacteria. It's going to cause cross contamination where maybe there's a wart in the line where you needed water or leftover chemical. So having really tight runs from A to B is helpful. Separately, especially when it comes down to breaking down a system, or if you're bringing in someone new to learn the system. You want to try and avoid the web of crisscrossed hoses. You don't want it to look like the power cords in your junk drawer. You want to have each hose very linear, and you want to when plumbing these setups, keep in consideration, one run to the next. So you're not kind of weaving in and out of different connections to make certain connections. Then finally, you can get creative. If you start off with one type of soft piping, you're not married to that. That's something where over time, this could be on a monthly, weekly basis, you can start to incorporate, new parts and pieces. You can start with a 90% soft pipe setup, and then within a year's time or less, it could be no more than 10%. Incorporate specific spools and hard piped connections to the setup and really start to minimize the amount of hosing that you're using. Or you can, you're operating, so now maybe you have a little bit of extra capital. You can, bring in a contractor and have someone help you custom hard pipe the setup, move all of the hosing all together. That's something that could easily be done. You see everything is already laid out, so they can take into consideration, use your hard pipe as their blueprint, and then sort of move on from there. So now I'm going to say it's time for us to hear more about the hard piping side of things. Don, you're ready. We're ready to hear what's the best how-to for some hard piping.
Yeah, I'm just going to take a step back here for 1 second. First off, want to thank Kevin and Michael for having me here on this discussion. In the course of putting together these systems out there, it's great having Brewmation as a partner, really getting these systems well thought out and making our customers happy by having a good workflow is important. So on this hard piping segment, I'm going to turn off my camera right now and just kind of go through the slides and pop back on for our Q&A in just a little bit. So for hard piping, it really comes down to having a good plan. There's a lot of different reasons to go with hard piping. In this case, this picture was from a brewery down in Mexico, my friend Pablo. He even put a nice little stainless steel section there with his logo. A lot of this comes down to identity. You're looking at an aesthetic that is going to kind of drive the brewery a little bit, but that is one of the reasons to get into hard piping and having this nice showcase setup. The other reasons are a little bit more procedural, and you're looking at having an easier setup. A lot of times when you have a skid mount system and a large garage door, it makes it very easy because you can just wheel in the system, have it ready to go. Take the floor pads and adjust them appropriately, and then you're all set and ready to go on the hot side there. Constant pathways. This is important when you're talking about training perspective. There's less connecting, disconnecting, which could lead to any number of errors. If you have wort stream going the wrong direction, or wort stream that is exposed to anything that can be contamination, that's usually definitely a bad thing. The less connecting and disconnecting that you're doing is going to also lead to less waste, because you don't want to have wort going to the floor for any particular reasons or whatnot. Another time that turnkey hard pipe system works out is when you're talking about using a single pump design, and sometimes that's for a budget concern, sometimes it's for simplicity, but using the hard pipe as a pathway diverter that allows you to maximize on that single pump. And then when doing hard piping, always think of your special procedures. No brewery is the same. Every brewery has a little different tasks that they may do, whether it be, the one that comes to mind is perhaps hop standing, or, having that recirculation where you're cooling to get more hop oils. Remember these things when you're doing a hard pipe setup, that you need to account for any special ports or pathways that you are going to use during the course of your brewing. What is a common setup and what can I do? Two entirely different things here when we're talking about the common setup is definitely going to be more your standard 2-vessel skid mount, where you're going to typically have a left-hand mash lauter tun, right-hand brew kettle, and that is just because typically we read left to right, process goes left to right, but Doesn't necessarily mean that you're stuck with that configuration. You can always, each one of these is a custom piece and can be modified ever so slightly, or to the furthest extent to meet the needs of your building. You're going to typically have a glass or stainless steel work grant, and that is dependent. The controls can definitely have a play in that. Sometimes it's just a matter of putting extra space for more pumps. If we're going to go with an advanced system, utilizing peristaltic pumps, then that grant doesn't have a purpose there. It is taken out, and we just make space for more, an extra pump in there, and utilize the controls in that fashion. But you're going to typically have hard pipe connects between the two vessels for the transfer of wort, the recirculation of wort, and in addition to that, you're going to have your CIP connections so that you're capable of cleaning those in place, those vessels. And then typically on one side, you would have space to mount most of your heat exchangers. And I say most because sometimes a heat exchanger for, say, lager knockouts may be sized so large that it might not fit. So that becomes a question as to whether or not the customer wants to have it mounted on the skid, or if the customer's planning on placing it elsewhere just for easier use. Now, remember, it's custom. You have options. So, you know, anything is possible when we're talking about it. You have to just be smart with your decisions. And that's why working with, working with our two companies, you have smart people who are going to set you up correctly for getting these systems sized appropriately. Once again, that is what Kevin was saying before. Turnkey is a well thought out system that is not going to be experiencing difficulties due to underestimating, say, a pump's capabilities, the draw and the feed and the length of the runs. In this particular case, this one fit exactly within its space, but if you look at it, there is a port that is directed towards the concrete versus having to go forward. That particular one is a circumstance of saying, okay, this is the size, but really actually jamming it into the exact size of the space. So if you also look at the valves up there, the valves are in a very awkward space to work on. So taking those drawings, taking those 3D renderings and measurements, and just making sure that we're accounting for everything there. So always remember the height and head of obstacles for your system. And this is a lot of times if you're going to go with a integrated grist case, that is a important thing to have the height for. It's definitely a nice feature because the integrated grist case cuts back on the amount of either auger or chain disc conveyance that you have, and puts the grist case above the mash tun for a gravity feed. There's some people who just they say, oh, I can't do a skid mount because I can't get it in my door, or I don't have the height. Just remember that that's not always the option. The skid mounting can be removed on the bottom, gaining you an extra 8 to 10 inches or so. It also allows you to bring in the vessels individually and to then place them around the platform and run the hard piping afterwards. So when the item is built, it is built and assembled, disassembled, and then shipped. Remember a logical workflow. That goes for the entirety of the brewery, but typically one thing that I always talk to people about is the location of your hot liquor tank. Making sure that the draws aren't incredibly far. I personally will try to place the hot liquor tank equidistant from the hot side and the cold side, just to make sure that I have the water that I need for brewing, but I also have easy access for CIP capability on the fermenters. So back to what Kevin said, planning is key. Make sure you have a floor plan. And this can be as involved as CAD work, like Kevin was speaking about earlier. It can be as basic as what Michael was saying with using string for running lengths. Heck, I've seen people take cardboard cutouts of diameters, place them on the floor, reposition them based off of trying to get an idea as to the actual layout of their brewery. But always remember all processes. So how will this integrate with your controls package? So this is a hard pipe system that is not fully assembled. And the reason that I put it in here is just so you could see these two pipes on the right-hand side. Those are going to be for a HERM system to have a pathway going out to your hot liquor tank. And that is part of the hard piping. But when it reaches the tail end of the skid, it actually does go to either soft piping, or a customer will decide to have someone do the hard piping on site, because a lot of the hard piping after your brew house is very difficult to know what the environment has in store for you as far as length. So it's typically done after the fact on site. Typically, you're going to have those pathways. You're going to also go back to our advanced discussion before. You're going to have more than 2 pumps. You have to have mounting brackets and space on the setup for it. Hot liquor tanks typically are soft pipe connections. Once the workflow is established, having those done hard pipe is sometimes done. But going back to what Michael said, you know, even though it was a fictional number, the 75%, I totally agree that most breweries will do a little bit of shuffling over the course of their time in order to make sure that their workflows are as efficient as possible. What kind of brewer are you? Do you use a blending station, or are you going direct into the mash tun or hydrator after stirring your hot liquor tank? That's definitely an important thing to consider. Having that blending station there is always nice, but you know, it may be that you just don't use it and you want to save a few dollars. That's another direction to go. Maybe that is just the way you've always brewed, and that's the way you're going to continue to brew. That's totally fine. And then having flow meter integration, and that really just depends on where in your setup you use a flow meter. I really enjoy having a flow meter on the actual brew house, but typically when you have the advanced controls that we sell through Brewmation, those advanced controls do have a readout and a mounting at the actual hot liquor tank. So, and then just remember, it has to get in the door. So planning is always important, and that's why working with a consultant, working with Stout, working with Brewmation, we are capable of answering those questions, setting you at ease when you decide to go with a system that is either soft pipe, hard pipe, and turnkey. That brings us to our question section.
Thanks a lot, Don. Michael, that was great. Yeah, we'll jump right into questions. We got a little bit over 10 minutes, so that's fantastic. One question comes up here. How are you suggesting using the HLT for CIP? Don, I'll let you handle that. You talked about that a little bit.
Typically, the reason that I suggest to put the HLT in between the brew house and the cold side of your operations, your fermenters and whatnot, is to minimize the initial connection. And you're going to connect to the bottom of the hot liquor tank, pull directly off of the bottom of the hot liquor tank using your cart pump, and go up through the CIP arms of your vessels. And this is your gives you the flow that you need in order to do a preheat of the vessel. It would actually be after cold flushing first, because you can bake on poison if you're not careful. But it gives you the ability to preheat those tanks, get them up to the proper temperatures for caustic cleans or whatever your detergent that you're using. in order to maximize them, but also not waste water. I've seen people that have too far of a draw. Their tanks are too big and they're using undersized pump, and the amount of water waste is pretty extravagant. So just good placement in process is important.
I'm gonna throw a question out here to each one of you. Maybe each one of you could chime in. What are your top 2 or 3 must-have brewery features?
You want to start?
That's an interesting question on that.
I'll go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
First is a big HLT. You know, having hot water at the ready at all times. I think that's ideal. You know, like with what Don said, you can never have enough hot water using it for CIP. So there's no need to get stingy on the size of HLT. Secondly, I think having a mash tun, you know, that's going to be that you can heat up. You know, ideally, a steam jacketed mash tun's really nice, but then also being able, if it's an electric or a direct fire system, be able to utilize a Herms coil or a RIMS tube to recorrect. You know, if you miss some temperatures or just to maintain your heat. And then finally, you know, an adequate plate chiller, you know, to knock out, you know, at a reasonable time, so you're not overheating oils, hot oils, and you know, so you can, you know, this is a part of the day you're almost done. You know, you just have some cleaning left to do. You don't want to be waiting 3 hours to to cool your batch down. You want to be able to pitch yeast and call it a day.
Very good. Do you want to go next, Kevin, or do you want me?
Well, Michael took a lot of mine, so the only thing I would add to that is drainage. You know, it's not necessarily part of the brewery equipment, but drainage is huge. You know, have the right drainage in there. That would be one I'd add.
That was my number one. Thanks for taking that. Yeah, if you've ever had to squeegee a floor to get all the water out of a brewery to keep everything clean, it's a pain in the neck. And definitely having good trench drains and drainage, sloped floors. Your floors huge, just to keep in the brewery going. But back to things that we do sell. The 2 other things that kind of pop to my mind are on your mash tun, you want an ease of grain out, and typically that is a feature that on some of the smaller systems people will upgrade just for the ease of grain out, going with maybe a wedge wire or a different setup for that ease of grain out. But some people that are just starting, they just have a budget and they stick with just a standard grain mash out with the oval door versus a rectangular door. And the rectangular door I definitely do like on that feature as well. And then my last one is a flow meter. Whether you have advanced or basic systems, I think a flow meter is just an absolute wonderful piece of equipment. They've come down in price so much, and it allows you to really watch the water you're using. And that just is great from a business perspective, but also great when you're considering that you want repeatability on your recipes.
Nice.
I'm gonna throw one out there to you guys. What do you guys think about hot water, on-demand hot water instead of an HLT for a 3-barrel system specifically, or even for larger systems?
I could jump in on the first part here. You know, we've done a lot of the systems using an on-demand heater, and especially if you have a smaller system and you're really putting it into a tiny area, it really could be a nice alternative to get you where you need to be. You could even automate it, like Don was just talking about flow meters. You could put a flow meter on it. You know, run it through a blender if you wanted to get a little bit more precise. It opens up a whole host of opportunities, and I think it's a really nice way to go. You know, I'll let the other guys talk a little bit more about that, you know, because obviously when you look at, you know, making it a liquor and having your additions, that might be one of the downplays there, but I'll let you guys chime in.
Yeah, do you want to go, Mike?
From Matt, this answer. you're going to be you're going to get a lot of water that you could reclaim instead of sending down the drain, especially during knocking. And so that's where a hot liquor tank is going to come in handy, or really if it's not even a heated tank, just a sort of a recovery tank, just to help prevent excess water going down the drain.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Typically, when I think about on-demand heaters, once again, it comes down to space constraint. Like Kevin said, if you're in an urban area and you have no choice, that's kind of the direction you have to go sometimes. There are workarounds. I've seen people that have come in really early, heated up their water, and sent it over to an empty fermenter and used it to heat sterilize their fermenter, and then used that as the hot liquor tank to come back. Very time consuming. Can definitely also put a little bit of metal fatigue if you have to keep going from cold to hot on those vessels on a regular basis like that. You're almost aging your equipment a little bit more. 2-barrel and below, I can see on demand. Once you start getting into about 3-barrel and above, I'm definitely a proponent of utilizing a hot liquor tank, because then not only I feel that the Herm system works really nice, because then you have a very gentle and indirect kind of heat you can use to correct your mash batches. In addition, you're going to reclaim that water from your heat exchanger. And the last reason is just because I'm a clean freak when it comes to being in the brewery. I like to have access to very hot water for cleaning. Having a hot liquor tank that can be set up as high as 190 degrees, so that by the time you're done and you do your CIPs, you're actually sitting at about 165. You're almost pasteurizing your tanks in the course of your final cleans, so that nothing really survives. But yeah, hot liquor, the lifeblood of your brewery, definitely.
There's a question. How do you feel about having 2 HLT, one for the RO and one for city water? And what would placement around the system look like?
I could answer that if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Don.
So when we're talking about 2 hot liquor tanks, you're talking about an expense that I don't necessarily think you need to have. I think this is actually a good moment to talk about an on-demand water heater. Having an on-demand water heater that you can use for your city water, and then having an appropriately sized or double-sized, if you need it, for your hot liquor tank for RO water is a nice way to go, because the RO water process is going to take a while. A lot of times it'll run many hours in order to get a reverse osmosis. So having a very large vessel to contain that is important. And if you have to use a little bit of the RO water for your cleaning, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that if you have 2 of those vessels and have the budget, go right ahead. But I don't believe they're necessary. I think 1 hot liquor tank and perhaps an on-demand hot water heater might be enough.
All right. Thanks for answering that. So just want to say that we got 1 minute left, which is pretty amazing timing. We might just beat out one of the other timings that we did on one of the previous ones. But Michael, Don, appreciate you guys joining here, and I think and I hope that this was real helpful for everyone. Just a quick note on the bottom, you'll see that there's a pop-up for scheduling a one-on-one with any of the presenters, obviously including all 3 of us. Please feel free to go ahead and click on that. Like I've told people, we had planned to be down in Texas this week, so we've all carved out time. So take a look in there if you do want to chat about some of these questions in more details. You have some other questions you'd rather ask one-on-one. Please go in there, schedule some time with us. We'd love to chat with you, and we'd certainly appreciate you joining and being a part of this. So thank you very much, everyone, and cheers and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Don. Kevin.